She was 26 years old when they cut her loose above the Idaho line. Not fired, not warned. Cut loose. A wagon with a split axle, one lame mule, a sky turning black over the Bitterroot Divide, and a freight captain who needed her to die before anyone asked why he had stopped at that exact bend in the road. What Gideon Rusk did not understand was that the giant fir lying beside that road was not just a fallen tree. It was a roof. The snow coming down around it was not only a burial, it was a wall. And Maren Bell carried that lesson in her bones because a dead man had taught it to her when she was 12 years old. The road over Crowglass Pass had never truly been a road. It was a scraped track of mud, stone, and old wheel ruts, climbing through a cold forest where the pines grew crooked from wind. In fair weather, a careful driver could take it slow and come through with nothing worse than sore hands and cursing animals. In November, with weather pressing down from the high country, it became a place that kept whatever it took. Maren had known the rear axle was failing 2 miles before it broke. She had felt the shudder through the wagon box. She had heard the groan under the load. She had even called forward to warn the line. But Gideon Rusk did not turn back until the wheel dropped sideways, with a sound like a bone snapping. By then, the freight train had halted in the open, and every man in it was looking at her. The wagon sat crooked in the road, its back corners sunk into the frozen mud. The canvas top cracked and snapped in the wind. Inside were sacks of oats, a few crates of lamp glass, bolts of rough cloth, and 2 barrels of nails that were not worth a man's life in that weather. That was what Rusk said. He said it loudly so the other drivers could hear. He said Maren had ridden the brake wrong on the downgrade. He said she had panicked the team. He said a woman who wanted a man's wages ought to learn a man's work before she broke a company wagon. He did not say the axle had been bound with old iron and wrought dark wood when she was handed the team outside Missoula. He did not say this was the oldest wagon in the string. He did not say he had ordered the train to stop at that narrow bend before anyone had finished arguing. Rusk was a hard, narrow man with a beard like black wire and eyes that never stayed still unless he was lying. He looked at the wheel. Then he looked at Maren. "You're done here," he said. The words landed flat. No heat, no anger left in them. Just a decision already made. He ordered the best 3 mules taken from her hitch and put onto the lead wagon. He left her with one animal, a dun mule named Rhyme, because even Rusk knew a dead woman found with nothing would raise too many questions. Then he took her rifle from the wagon seat. Maren stepped toward him. "That's mine." Rusk turned just enough for the men to see the pistol at his belt. "Company property until damages are settled." Nobody moved. Not because they believed him, because the storm had begun to speak through the trees, and fear had a way of making men look down at their boots. One driver, old Harp Sloan, would not meet Maren's eyes. Another swallowed as if he meant to say something and found no room for it in his throat. Rusk mounted his horse. "Walk down when the weather clears," he said. "Or stay with the wagon makes no difference to me. But every person on that pass knew the truth. The weather was not going to clear. The first flakes did not fall gently. They came sideways, hard as grit, ticking against the wagon cover and melting on Maren's cheeks. She stood in the road as the freight line pulled away. The sound of wheels faded. The bells on the lead harness vanished into the white air. Then the last wagon disappeared around a shoulder of dark rock, and the mountain became quiet in the way a room becomes quiet after someone locks the door from the outside. Maren did not scream after them. Screaming was heat leaving the body. She needed every bit of heat she had. She took inventory. One wagon with a broken rear axle, one mule, a half canteen of water, 7 hard biscuits, a twist of dried venison in a flour sack, 2 blankets, 1 bedroll, a coil of rope, a small hatchet with a cracked handle, and a tin cup. The company cargo was mostly dead weight: oats, nails, cloth, lamp glass. Useful in town, useless under a killing sky. The cold was already moving through her gloves. The pass was above 6,000 feet. By dark, the temperature would fall far enough to freeze spilled water into a skin of glass before a person finished cursing it. By morning, if the wind held, exposed skin would go numb in minutes. Maren looked down the road. No shelter, no cabin smoke, no cut trail dropping to the valley. Only timber, stone, and the storm closing the world in pieces. Then she saw the fur. Not standing, fallen. It lay below the road, on the lee side of the slope, half hidden under old snow and blown needles. The trunk was broader than a wagon box, 6 feet through at the butt, black-barked and ribbed with frozen moss. Its root plate had ripped out of the ground years earlier and stood upright like the wall of a ruined fort. The tree had fallen parallel to the hill, leaving a long, dark pocket beneath the curve of its trunk. Most people would have seen firewood. Maren saw a house waiting to be finished. The sight brought back a voice she had tried for years not to miss. Her father had been a timberman on the north shore of Lake Superior, a quiet Swede named Maren Bell, who knew forests by pressure, grain, and weather. He could look at a standing pine and tell where it wanted to fall. He could listen to ice on a river and know whether it would hold a sled team or swallow it. When Maren was 12, a sleet storm caught them 3 miles from camp. She remembered trying not to cry from the cold. Her father had led her to the underside of a storm-fallen spruce and made her put her hand against the earth beneath it. "Feel this," he said. She had expected ice. Instead, the ground was cold, but not sharp. Still, protected. He tapped the trunk above them. "A roof is anything that stops the sky," he said. "A wall is anything that stops the wind. Folks die because they keep looking for a cabin. The animals live because they understand shape." Then he scooped snow into his mitten and crushed it in his palm. "Snow
is air wearing a coat, he told her. Pack it right, and it will hold your warmth better than boards. He had shown her the hollow under the log, the leeward side, the way drifted snow piled where wind lost its teeth, the small vent that kept smoke from turning a shelter into a coffin. He was not giving a speech about courage. He was showing a child how the world worked. Now, 14 years later, on a pass that wanted her dead, that lesson became the richest inheritance Maren Bell owned.
She had less than an hour of light. The first task was impossible, so she made it smaller. She did not need to fix the wagon. She did not need to pull it down the mountain. She only needed to move it 40 yards from the open road to the fallen fir. She unloaded everything heavy. The barrels of nails nearly beat her. Each one had to be rolled out, caught before it crushed her foot, then shoved through fresh snow toward the tree. She dragged the sacks of oats one by one. She pulled the cloth bolts under the root plate where they would stay dry. Her breath burned. Her lungs felt scraped. Her fingers went clumsy inside the gloves. But the wagon rose a little with every burden removed. Rhyme watched her with long, patient ears and the insulted expression of an animal who knew men were the source of most bad ideas.
All right, Maren said to him. You and me. She cut what remained of the harness and ran rope under the wagon's front frame. The broken wheel dragged sideways, useless. She took the hatchet and hacked a stout limb from a dead lodgepole, then wedged it beneath the axle like a pry bar. The first branch snapped. The second shot loose and threw her into the snow. For one frightening second she lay there looking up at the darkening sky, and the thought came clean and simple. This is how it happens. Not in a grand way, not with last words. Just one fall too many, and the cold finishing the work. Then Rhyme snorted. Maren rolled to her side and forced herself up. No, she whispered, not to the mule, to the mountain, to Rusk, to the story they had already started telling about her.
She found another lover, shorter and stronger, braced it under the axle, and put her shoulder to it. Pull! Rhyme leaned into the collar. The wagon lurched. 1 foot, then nothing. Again, the rope creaked. The mule strained. The broken wheel carved a ragged scar through snow and mud. Another foot. The work became a cruel little rhythm. Brace, heave, pull, breathe, reset. She stopped counting distance. She counted breaths. She counted the seconds before her hands failed. She counted the little movements that were not enough by themselves and would have to become enough together. By the time the wagon reached the fir, the world beyond 20 paces had vanished. Snow filled the air so thickly the forest looked unfinished. Maren drove the wagon as close as she could to the trunk, angling the open side against the hollow beneath the tree. The fallen fir blocked the high wind. The root plate protected the north end. The hillside closed the back. The shape was there. She had to teach it to hold. She cut the frozen canvas from the wagon hoops and dragged it over the outer side, fastening one edge to roots and broken limbs, the other to the wagon boards. It made a sloped skin from trunk to ground, low enough to shed wind, steep enough to keep the snow from crushing it. Then she built the wall. No shovel, no time. She used a split board from the wagon bed. Scoop, throw, pack, press. She piled snow along the canvas and tamped it with her boots until it hardened. She sealed the cracks at the ground. She banked the ends. She left one crawl space no wider than her shoulders, turned away from the wind. Snow is air wearing a coat.
Her father's words moved with her hands. By full dark, the wagon, the tree, the hillside, and the storm itself had become a shelter. Not a good one, not a warm one, a living one. She led Rhyme inside. The mule refused at first, backing away from the dark pocket under the log. Maren put her forehead against his muzzle and spoke to him until he came forward. His body filled half the space. His warmth was not comfort. It was fuel. Maren crawled in beside him and pulled the last flap of canvas across the entrance. The storm struck the pass with its whole body. Outside, the wind screamed through timber and drove snow over the road where the wagons had been. Inside, under the fallen fir, the sound changed. It became low, distant.
A heavy drumming through wood and packed snow. Maren lay in the dark with her knees drawn up, one hand pressed against the mule's flank, the other against the old fir trunk above her. The cold inside the shelter was honest. It hurt. It crept. It searched for seams in clothing and blood. But it did not tear at her. That was the difference. Outside was killing cold, wind cold, the kind that robbed a body faster than the body could answer. Inside was still cold. Stillness could be endured. The first night did not pass. It had to be survived 1 inch at a time. Maren forced herself not to sleep too deeply. She flexed her toes inside her boots until they answered with pain. She rubbed her hands under her arms. She ate one hard biscuit in tiny pieces and let each bite soften before she swallowed it, because dry food took moisture, and moisture was life. At some point, smoke became the next danger. She needed flame, but flame needed breath. She broke dry splinters from the underside of the old fir, where years of weather had not reached. In an iron nail pan, she built a fire smaller than a man's fist, and held the tin cup over it to melt snow. The smoke gathered low and mean. Her eyes watered. She remembered her father pushing a mitten through the top of a snowbank, making a vent no wider than a boot heel. "Fire has to leave the house too," he had said. So Maren cut a narrow slit high in the canvas and cleared a tunnel through the packed snow with the handle of the hatchet. The draft caught slowly. Smoke began to pull toward the opening in a thin gray thread. She coughed until her chest hurt. Then she laughed once, without humor, because she was still alive enough to cough. For 2 days the storm owned the mountain. Morning was only a pale change in the darkness. Night was the dark becoming complete. Maren's world shrank to tasks. Melt snow. Feed Rhyme a handful of oats. Break slivers of dry fur. Keep the vent open. Keep the entrance from sealing shut. Eat less than hunger demanded. Move fingers. Move toes. listen. Again and again, the storm tried to erase the shelter. Snow pressed on the canvas. Wind drove powder through cracks. Once, during the second night, a section near the entrance sagged so low that Maren had to crawl out into the roar and beat the drift loose with both hands until her sleeves froze stiff. She came back inside, shaking so hard she could not untie her scarf. That was the darkest hour. Not because the shelter failed, because she understood how narrow the margin was. A bad knot, a weak seam, a mule lying down wrong, a vent closing while she slept. Any of those things could make Rusk right. And she hated that more than she feared death. Not death itself, the theft of her meaning. The thought of men in a warm room saying she had been careless, saying she had cost the company a wagon, saying the mountain had taken a foolish girl who had no business driving freight. That lie burned hotter than the coal she did not have. So Maren stayed awake and answered the storm with work. On the third morning, the wind lost its edge. It did not stop. It backed away. The roar softened into a long, wounded moan, then into a whisper moving high through the branches above the buried road. Light pushed through the canvas, blue and thin. Maren opened the entrance and found a wall of snow. For a moment, she only stared. Then she began to dig. The split board had become polished from use. Her hands were swollen. The first tunnel collapsed twice. The third held. When she finally broke through, sunlight hit her face so bright it felt like pain. The pass had changed shape completely. 4 feet of snow lay on the level ground, and the drifts around the fur rose higher than the wagon. The road was gone. The wagon tracks were gone. The place where the freight train had abandoned her was a smooth white sentence with every word erased. But from the base of the fallen tree, a faint thread of smoke lifted into the still air. That thread saved her twice. The man who saw it was not looking for miracles. Elias Ward was a government packer who knew Crowglass Pass well enough to dislike it in any season. He had come up from Alderfall after the freight train arrived late, short 1 wagon, and full of men who could not keep their stories in order. Rusk had told the company office that Maren Bell broke an axle and tried to walk down in the storm. Then he said she chose to stay. Then he said no one could have forced her either way. Harp Sloan said nothing at all, and that silence had troubled Elias more than any statement. So he took 2 pack animals and came up the pass after the storm, expecting the usual things the mountains returned. A broken wagon, a frozen mule, maybe a body. He did not expect smoke. Elias stopped beside the buried root plate with his rifle lowered but ready. "Hello in there." The snow around the log breathed. A flap moved. A woman crawled out, black with soot around the eyes, hair stiff with frost, mouth cracked from thirst,
and eyes steady enough to make him step back. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Elias looked at the fur, the canvas slope, the packed snow wall, the little smoke vent still breathing above the shelter. He had trapped in mountains for 15 years. He had built lean-tos, brush beds, dugouts, willow huts, and bad shelters that lasted one night because they were too stubborn to fall.
He had never seen a freight driver turn wreckage, animal heat, snow, and a dead tree into something this sound under that kind of storm. "How did you know to build it like that?" he asked. Maren wiped blood from a split knuckle. "My father cut timber," she said. Elias nodded as if she had handed him a complete explanation. He did not call her lucky. He did not call her poor thing. He looked at the shelter again and said, "Then he taught you better than most men get taught." That was the first kindness she had heard in 3 days. It nearly broke her. Elias gave her coffee first because he was a practical man and knew when words were useless. He gave Rhyme grain. He built a larger fire in the open and set bacon hissing in a pan. The smell hurt more than hunger had. As she ate, Maren told him what Rusk had done. She kept her voice even. She listed facts. The warning about the axle, the public blame, the removed team, the taken rifle. The way the freight captain had hurried the others past the bend before the first real blast of weather hit. Elias listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked toward the road buried above them. "Rusk did not leave you because a wagon broke," he said. Maren looked at him. Elias stood and walked to the root plate. "He stopped here because he meant to stop here." That was when the shelter gave up the second truth. They were digging out the wagon's back corner to free supplies when Elias's shovel hit wood that did not belong to the wreck. Not root, not wagon board. Boxwood. The sound was dull and hollow under the snow. Maren moved closer. Together they cleared the drift packed against the underside of the fallen fir. The object lay deep in the old hollow, behind a curtain of roots and frozen needles, exactly where fresh snow would hide it by morning. It was a narrow crate, bound with black iron, no company mark. Elias pried the lid loose with the shovel edge. Inside was not oats, not lamp glass, not cloth. It was wrapped silver plate, small enough to travel and valuable enough to kill for. Beneath it lay watchmaker's tools in velvet rolls, French needles in tin cases, and 3 leather packets sealed with bank wax. Elias opened one packet and went still. "Drafts," he said. "Helena bank drafts." Maren felt the cold change inside her. Not colder, sharper. They dug again. A second crate held ivory-handled instruments and imported razor sets. A third held coin bags with the markings cut out of the cloth. Elias swore softly. For months, freight offices between Helena and Lewiston had been reporting high-value goods missing from mixed loads. Nothing large enough to stop a shipment, nothing obvious enough to prove. A packet here, a small case there. Goods that could be blamed on bad counting, road thieves, warehouse mistakes, careless drivers. Rusk had been bleeding the line, and Crowglass Pass had given him the perfect vault. A giant deadfall beside a road every freight man recognized. A hollow no one would inspect in good weather. A place deep snow could cover in a single night. The broken axle had given him cover. Maren had given him a witness. The storm had given him an execution. Only the shelter had ruined the plan. Elias looked from the hidden crates to Maren's face. "He didn't strand a driver," he said. "He tried to bury a witness." The words did not surprise her. They named what her body had known from the moment he took the rifle. Maren stared at the crates under the fir. The same tree that had kept her alive had been chosen to hide the proof of why she was supposed to die. A roof, a wall, and now a witness. They packed what they could onto Elias's animals and Rhyme. The rest they marked and buried under brush where no drifting snow could fully smooth the disturbance. The descent took 2 days. Maren walked most of it. Her legs trembled on the long slopes, but she would not ride while Rhyme carried the stolen goods. Elias did not argue. He only slowed his pace when he heard her breathing shorten. They passed 2 places where the storm had punished the freight train. One overturned wagon, its cargo scattered in a frozen fan. A dead mule, half buried in a drift, harness straps still taut. A broken singletree standing upright from the snow like a grave marker. Maren looked at each one and said nothing. By the time the roofs of Alderfall appeared in the valley, smoke rising straight from chimneys into the clean, cold air, she had stopped feeling like someone returning from death. She felt like evidence walking downhill. The freight office was too warm. That was the first thing Maren noticed. Heat rolled from the black stove in the corner. Wet wool steamed on hooks near the door. Men turned when she stepped inside, and their faces showed the same expression in different stages. Recognition, confusion, fear of what recognition meant. Gideon Rusk stood beside the counter with a coffee cup in his hand. The cup slipped a little when he saw her. Not enough to fall, enough for Maren to see. Mr. Orville Pritchard, the company agent, rose from behind his ledger. He was a heavy man with spectacles and a permanent ink saint on his middle finger. "Miss Bell?" Rusk found his voice first. "You should be dead." The room became silent. It was the only honest sentence he had spoken. Elias stepped forward and placed one of the sealed bank packets on the counter. Then another. Then the velvet roll of watchmaker's tools. Then a silver-backed brush with the owner's initials still engraved on the handle. "You may want your lost books," Elias said, "and the marshal." Rusk began talking, too fast. He said he had never seen those goods. He said Maren must have found them. He said Elias was mistaken. He said the storm had confused everyone. He said a woman left alone for 3 days could not be trusted to know what happened. Maren listened. Then she told the room the story from the beginning, not as a plea, not as a performance, as a ledger of facts. The axle shuddered 2 miles before failure. She warned the line. Rusk blamed her in front of witnesses. He removed the team. He took her rifle. He left her before the storm closed. He told the office a changing story.
The hidden crates were found under the fallen fir beside the abandoned wagon.
Every sentence put another nail through his version of events. Harp Sloan stood in the rear of the room. His hat was crushed in both hands. When the marshal arrived, Harp finally spoke. His voice was almost too quiet. "He made us drive on," he said. "She told him about the axle. I heard her." Rusk turned on him with a look that had probably stopped weaker men for years. Harp did not look away this time. "And he took her rifle," he added. That ended it. Not loudly, not with a fight. The truth did not need to shout once it had enough weight. The marshal took Gideon Rusk by the arm. Rusk pulled once, then seemed to understand how many men in the room were suddenly interested in seeing him fail. He went pale and let himself be led out. The bell over the office door gave a small, ridiculous jingle as he passed under it. Maren remembered that sound for the rest of her life. Mr. Pritchard paid her wages first. Then he paid the damages Rusk had tried to charge against her. Then he paid a recovery reward, large enough that the room went quiet again. But the money was not the thing that cleared her name. It was the notice he wrote in his own hand and posted outside the freight office before sundown. Maren Bell was not responsible for the lost wagon. Maren Bell warned the train of mechanical failure. Maren Bell survived the Crowglass storm through her own skill. Maren Bell recovered stolen company property and exposed the man responsible. Pritchard signed it. The marshal witnessed it. Harp Sloan signed too, his hand shaking as he made the letters. That paper mattered because lies like Rusk's lived by moving faster than the people they hurt. For once, the truth arrived before the lie could settle. Maren did not stay with the company. Pritchard offered her work in the office, then a safer route, then a bonus if she would remain on the books. She refused all of it. A person could forgive a broken axle. She could even understand fear. But she would not build a life under a roof owned by men who waited to see whether conscience was convenient. With the reward money, she bought 80 acres above Alderfall, where a creek ran year-round under willow roots and the timber stood thick enough for building. The land was poor for wheat and good for a person who knew wood. That suited her. She bought a cross-cut saw, 2 milk goats, 6 hens, a stove with 1 cracked fire brick, and more nails than any sensible woman would carry home in one trip. Elias Ward came by when the snows allowed it. He did not bring pity. He brought salt, news, letters when they came, and once, without a word, a rifle that fit her shoulder better than the one Rusk had taken. They built her cabin through the spring. Maren chose the logs. Elias helped lift the high courses. They argued once about the chimney draw, and she was right, which pleased him more than it annoyed him. Their friendship never became a story people could easily name, and that may have been why it lasted. He saw her clearly. She trusted him to keep doing it. Years passed. The fallen fir on Crowglass Pass became a landmark with a history. Teamsters pointed it out to new drivers. Packers told the tale when the weather shifted. Trappers caught above the timberline remembered the woman who had lived under a tree because she understood that snow could kill a person or save one, depending on the shape you gave it. Maren never liked hearing the story made grand. When men called it a miracle, she corrected them. There was no miracle, she would say. There was a roof, a wall, and a mule with good sense. But children listened harder when she told it than men did. She taught them to look at wind first, then slope, then drift, then shelter, then fuel, then escape, in that order. A roof stops sky, she told them. A wall stops wind. Heat is not something you own. It is something you keep from leaving. That was the lesson, not bravery, not luck, not revenge. Shape. Maren lived on that 80 acres for 51 years. She became known for storm sense, clean joinery, and an unwillingness to accept a fool's explanation just because a man gave it loudly. In winter, travelers found her cabin by the iron lantern she hung under the eave when weather turned. More than one person survived a bad night because Maren Bell had taught the valley to see shelter where it had once seen only snow. She died in her own bed in February of 1933, with the creek frozen white and a stack of split fir beside the stove. Elias had been gone 12 years by then. Rhyme, the mule, much longer. The cabin still stood square. Long after that, when the freight road became a memory and the pass was used mostly by hunters and survey crews, a young forestry man found the old fir. It was half sunk into the earth by then, furred with moss, seedlings growing from its back. The root plate had softened and collapsed. The road above it had narrowed to a scar between the trees. But beneath the trunk, the hollow remained. Not natural, too clean in its angle, too deliberate in its packed berm, too clearly shaped by hands that had understood exactly what wind would do, what snow would do, and what a body needed to live through the night. The young man did not know Maren's name. He did not know Gideon Rusk's name either. That seemed fair. He only knelt in the old hollow and studied the work. The mountain had forgotten the lie. The timber had kept the lesson. A roof is anything that stops the sky. A wall is anything that stops the wind.